Powered by Riverside
Welcome back
FM.
to returning listeners and welcome to new listeners. This is 1 year on. My name is Alison, and following on from episode 3, today's episode is about my venturing into Pride and Prejudice territory and what made the speech assessment so confronting. I sought solace in Pride and Prejudice. My love of Jane Austen goes back to my teens. My granny had given me an old hardback of Pride and Prejudice, which I devoured. I read all of Jane Austen's works, but Pride and Prejudice was my favourite. I also watched several adaptations of the book. The BBC 1980s version with David Rintoul and Elizabeth Garvey, which was the first version I saw back in the 90s. And then the really old version with Laurence Olivier and Greer Garson. More recently, I've fallen in love with the Colin Firth and Jennifer L version, which I think is my favourite, and I've also seen the Keira Knightley version, which I simply don't like. I've also seen adaptations which aren't faithful, more of a rewrite and changing the storyline. Needless to say, if you don't already know, I'm a bit of an addict. As an adult, if I ever was sick, I would take to the couch and binge watch the Colin Firth version and lose myself, and it would definitely make me feel a lot better. After having the stroke, I put the Firth version of Pride and Prejudice on. It was a comfort to know that Pride and Prejudice was a constant. I then told my husband that I wanted to watch the other versions I knew from the 90s. And he managed to find them somehow, so I immersed myself again in David Rintoul and Laurence Olivier. I'd forgotten how hyperbolic and caricature-like the Olivier version is. I can't even remember if I loved it back then. I certainly didn't love it now. I cringed, but it was solace. I also noticed a change in my appetite for food, and I would only want to eat half what I normally ate. This was very different. I think I was numb. I certainly felt very different. A lot of my food ended up as leftovers in the fridge. I took to crawling around the house. Strange to think of that now. I had remembered a physiotherapist telling me when my son was little that they often got preschoolers and kindergartners to crawl if they were having developmental delay with their education, as it makes the hemispheres of the brain work together. Crossing the midline, as they called it, the midline being the midpoint of the body if you're dividing the body into the left half and the right. And so I thought I should do this, as the doctors had spoken of neuroplasticity and rewiring the brain in the hospital. My 3 dogs must have thought this very strange, and they followed me around all the time. I also sang. I've sang in a choir for more than 20 years, and it gives me a lot of pleasure. Apparently singing uses a different part of the brain to speaking, and a doctor friend recommended to me that I should do just this to aid my recovery. My current choir has practice tracks available to us, and so I was singing away while standing in the kitchen. That cheered me up a lot. I love my singing, and I would have been so upset had I not been able to sing. But apart from all these activities, I sat in silence and had to have the house in complete silence. The dogs barking were a great irritation and difficulty. The speech pathologist's office called back and offered me a cancellation appointment 6 days after the stroke. I was so happy, as this would mean I could get started on speech therapy as quickly as possible. Andrew drove me, and it was at the opposite side of town, so we were in the car for about half of an hour. That journey felt like a lifetime. I took the assessment, and I'm rereading my report produced now. It was said that I reported I had no issue with understanding language as it was spoken to me. I told the speechie that I had trouble misspelling words and finding words and producing written work, which of course I knew I needed to do my job. I was so focused on getting back to work. I sat in a room, my husband on the other side of the room, and me across from the speech pathologist. I remember getting very upset when presented with these tests, as I could clearly see me having significant problem with the tasks. I started crying and asked him to leave the room. I didn't want him to see my impairments laid bare at this point. The assessment had a variety of findings. The report is very plain. I had some impairment in naming words associated with a topic. Impairment with definitions. Oh, I did terribly in that one. When explaining idioms, I had impairment as I didn't give much detail. When I was tested on sentence construction, I had some impairment. Sequencing and planning for an activity, I had moderate impairment and was unable to produce the right number of steps and unable to provide complete information. In terms of my sentence repetition, I had moderate impairment and only got 2 out of 5 correct. With a passage recall, oh dear, I remember that one. She was telling me a complicated story involving people coming from Brisbane to Sydney and going across to New Zealand. I couldn't remember parts of that story, nor retell it correctly, which was the task. The speech she read out a series of relationships. Is someone's sister their father's daughter or their daughter's father? And I got some of those incorrect too. I remember really struggling with the task of name words beginning with the letter whatever. I think I managed about 5, whereas usually I would have managed at least 4 times that in the time allowed. Oh dear, I simply had a mental blank. I was assessed as mild to moderate receptive and expressive aphasia, impacting certain areas of language, auditory memory and comprehension, verbal expression, written expression and planning skills. So this is where the issue lay, and it was impeding my ability to communicate and participate in the world. This was where I would need to get to fix it with therapy. I thought that would be simple. How wrong I was. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please like, share and subscribe. I will be back next time to describe my emotional state in the early days, which was very sensitive. Thank you for listening.